The sea is a quiet liar. From the shore it looks soft, gentle, even friendly. But far from the land, where the waves rise like trembling walls, the truth becomes clear. The ocean does not forgive weakness. And during the dark years of the Second World War, thousands of men sailed across those waters on ships that carried hope, fear, supplies, and the weight of nations. On a cold winter morning in the North Atlantic, one of those ships began to shiver. It was a sound barely louder than a whisper, a thin crack like ice breaking under a boot. No one noticed at first. The crew continued their work, breathing in the frozen air, watching for enemy submarines that hid beneath the waves. But the ship felt it. Metal under strain. Steel pushed beyond its limits. Minutes later the crack grew. It traveled across the hull in a line that moved faster than a man could run. A sailor standing on deck felt the vibration under his feet. He looked down, and his face went pale. The ship was coming apart. Not from an explosion. Not from a torpedo. But from itself. Within moments the Liberty ship broke cleanly into two pieces. The bow rose sharply, like a wounded animal trying to breathe. The stern slid backward into the dark sea. Men shouted. Some prayed. Some froze in shock, unable to understand how a ship made of steel could split open like thin glass. This was not the first time it happened. And if nothing changed, it would not be the last. But in the middle of this quiet disaster, far from the sea, far from the warfront, far from the noise of politics and commanders, there was one civilian. A man whose name the world barely knew. A man who did not lead armies or design weapons. He simply looked at steel, and saw something others had missed. Perhaps this is where our story truly begins. Not with power, not with generals, but with a question whispered inside an ordinary mind. Why were these ships breaking? And how could they be saved? The world of the 1940s was made of urgency. Factories roared day and night. Smoke climbed into the sky like a second atmosphere. The war needed ships, thousands of them. Ships to carry food, oil, guns, medicine, hope. And so the Liberty ship was born not out of luxury or beauty but out of need. A simple design. Straight lines. Fast to build. Cheap enough to replace. Workers with almost no experience in shipbuilding arrived at the docks every day. Teachers, farmers, clerks, grandmothers, and young boys who had lied about their age. They held welding torches and shaking hands, learning as they worked. The sound of hammering, welding, and shouting filled the air from sunrise to sunset. Some days the smell of hot metal mixed with the smell of soup from a food cart nearby. Some days sparks flew like tiny stars, landing on coats and boots. People wiped sweat from their eyes as they pushed to meet impossible deadlines. A ship every few days. A vessel born from fire and fear. And yet, for all the effort, for all the hope, something was wrong. Ships were cracking. Ships were breaking. Ships were failing in calm waters where storms did not exist. At first, military leaders blamed the welders. Then they blamed the materials. Then the weather. But nothing made sense. And no one wanted to stop production, not when the war was swallowing lives every hour. It was during this chaos that the civilian, this quiet engineer with simple clothes and tired eyes, stepped forward. He was not the kind of man people noticed. He spoke softly. He walked with careful steps. He did not impress anyone with medals or titles. But he saw patterns. He saw stress shifting through steel. He saw danger hidden inside the shape of a hull. While others argued, he observed. While others blamed workers or fate, he studied the lines of the fractures. He watched how cracks spread, where they stopped, and what they tried to escape. In the silence of his small office, he traced each break with a pencil, following the path of destruction like a detective following a trail. Perhaps it was here, under a dim lamp, in the quiet of a workshop far from the sea, that the war began to change. He noticed something simple. Something almost too simple. The ships were strong, but too strong in the wrong places. Their steel plates were welded, not riveted like older ships. Welding saved time, but it also created stiffness. Stiffness meant the ship could not bend with the rhythm of the ocean. Instead of flexing, the steel held its breath until it snapped. In a way, these great ships broke for the same reason glass shatters. They could not move. This realization was small. But small things, when held up to the light, can change the world. He spoke to committees. He drew new designs. He explained again and again that the solution was not stronger steel but smarter steel, steel that understood the sea. He proposed crack arresters, changes in shape, new reinforcement around stress points. Some officials listened. Many did not. Who was this ordinary man to question the decisions of powerful engineers? Who was he to slow down ship production in the middle of a war? But he kept pushing. Calmly. Quietly. Patiently. Because he knew the ocean would not wait. And every ship lost meant hundreds of lives, and thousands of dreams, sinking into cold water. Out at sea, sailors felt the fear even if they never spoke of it. They touched the steel walls of their cabins and wondered if a crack was already forming somewhere deep inside the hull. They heard creaks in the night and held their breath. Some carried good luck charms. Some wrote letters to their families before every voyage, unsure if they would return. The wind smelled of salt and oil. The engines hummed below. The ship rolled gently as if pretending to be harmless. But everyone knew the truth. A Liberty ship could betray them without warning. And still they sailed. Because the world needed them. Because the war depended on the supplies they carried. Because courage is sometimes nothing more than walking forward when every step feels uncertain. Back in the design room, the civilian continued to fight his quiet battle. He was not pushing for glory. He was pushing for safety. For stability. For the simple belief that a ship should not fall apart from fear. When his redesigns were finally accepted, they spread across the shipyards like a new language. Engineers studied the drawings. Workers adjusted their tools. New Liberty ships rolled into the water with changes hidden beneath their steel skin. And slowly, almost silently, the cracking stopped. The ocean, which once broke these ships with a cruel snap, now met resistance. The hulls flexed. The steel breathed. The design held. These were no longer fragile vessels. They were machines of survival. Machines of war. And the world would soon see their strength. This is the story of how one quiet mind, far from the battlefield, changed the shape of history. Not with weapons. Not with power. But with understanding. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest kind of strength. The shipyards of America were unlike anything the world had seen before. They stretched across coastlines like giant steel forests, growing ships instead of trees. Every morning before the sun rose, workers gathered at the gates with their lunch boxes, their gloves, and their determination. Some were old, with stiff backs and wrinkled hands. Others were young, barely old enough to shave. Many were women who had never worked with heavy machines before, but now stepped forward as welders, cutters, and inspectors. The war changed everyone, and the shipyards became a symbol of that change. The sound inside these yards was powerful. Hammers rang like metal bells. Welding torches hissed with sharp blue light. Sparks flew through the air, landing on the ground like tiny burning stars. The smell of oil mixed with salt water. Steam rose from hot metal, drifting through the air like thin ghosts. The shipyards felt alive, as if each ship was being born from fire and noise. Yet beneath all this movement there was pressure to build faster, cheaper, and in huge numbers. The enemy was sinking ships faster than America could build them. Every lost ship meant lost supplies, lost soldiers, and lost hope. So production pushed forward with unstoppable force. The Liberty ship was the answer to this crisis. It was not beautiful. It did not shine like the fancy liners of the past. Its shape was simple, almost plain, with straight edges and wide decks. But it was practical. Could be built in weeks instead of months. It used welding instead of riveting, allowing unskilled workers to join plates quickly. It was designed to carry huge loads across the dangerous Atlantic. When the first Liberty ships rolled into the water, crowds cheered. Their horns echoed across the harbor. Reporters took photos, calling them the ships that could win the war. And for a time hope was strong. But soon troubling whispers spread. Rumors that some ships were cracking. Rumors that others split in half without warning. Rumors that the sea was exposing a weakness no one expected. The truth was terrifying. Engineers began to investigate, but the evidence was confusing. The steel looked strong. The welds looked clean. The structure seemed correct. Yet the failures continued. Some ships cracked in the middle. Others cracked near the bow. One even broke apart while tied to the dock, without a single wave touching its hull. This mystery frightened everyone. How could a ship be dangerous even in calm water? What invisible flaw was hiding inside the steel? Shipbuilders felt guilty, thinking they had done something wrong. Sailors felt cursed, thinking the sea was punishing them. Commanders felt uncertain, fearing that the backbone of the supply chain was weaker than they believed. And in the middle of this confusion, the quiet civilian continued studying the problem. He walked through broken ship pieces like a doctor examining a wounded patient. He ran his hands along jagged metal edges. He took notes in small notebooks, filling pages with sketches and thoughts. Every crack told a story, and he was listening. He noticed something unusual in the shape of the fractures. They moved in clean, straight lines as if following a hidden path. They did not twist or bend. They cut through steel with unnatural precision. To him it looked less like a mistake and more like a clue. In his small office he compared dozens of crack patterns. He studied temperature reports. He read about metal fatigue, stress, and the impact of cold. He observed that many breaks happened in freezing waters. Cold steel becomes brittle. Brittle steel does not bend. And welded structures, unlike riveted ones, do not allow stress to escape slowly. They hold everything inside, until the pressure becomes too much. This was his breakthrough. He realized that the Liberty ships were too rigid. Their welded skins made them behave like one solid piece. But the ocean is not a friendly place for anything that refuses to move. Waves twist ships. Storms pull them in different directions. Even gentle swells create stress. A normal ship bends with these forces like a tree bending in the wind. But the Liberty ships stood stiff and cracked. He proposed a solution that sounded simple but required courage to implement. The ships needed flexibility. They needed crack stoppers, new reinforcements, and slight changes to the hull shape. They needed to breathe with the sea, not resist it. Many officials did not want to hear this. It meant slowing production, redesigning parts, and admitting that mistakes had been made. But slowly the truth became impossible to ignore. Reports from the ocean grew more serious. More ships cracked. More lives were lost. And the pressure forced leaders to listen. When the new design elements were added, the change was dramatic. Ships that would have cracked now survived storms. Hulls that once failed under cold temperatures remained strong. The Liberty ships were reborn, strengthened not by armor or weapons but by understanding. Out at sea, sailors began to trust their vessels again. They felt safer crossing the icy Atlantic. The ship no longer groaned like a dying creature. It held firm beneath their boots. The sound of cracking steel became a fading memory. Supplies flowed across the ocean in massive amounts: tanks, food, medical kits, ammunition, fuel. Entire armies depended on this lifeline of steel. And because of the improvements, the Liberty ships carried these precious loads through enemy-infested waters with new confidence. What once looked like fragile containers were now machines of survival, holding the weight of the world on their decks. But the most remarkable part of this story was not the steel or the design or the war. It was the quiet truth that one ordinary man, with no fame or medals, changed the fate of nations simply by noticing what others overlooked. His design saved lives. His insight strengthened a fleet. His patience protected sailors he would never meet. In a world full of noise, sometimes the softest mind sees the deepest truth. These redesigned ships went on to serve not just in wartime but long after. Many were turned into cargo carriers, training vessels, or civilian transports. A few still rest in museums, their steel bodies holding the memory of the struggle they survived. When you stand before one today, you might smell the faint scent of rust mixed with salt. You might touch the rough metal and feel its history. You might close your eyes and imagine the sound of waves hitting the hull in the darkness. And you might understand that this ship is more than steel. It is a story of fear, failure, discovery, survival, and quiet genius. The Liberty ship became a symbol of what humans can do when they refuse to give up, even when the world is breaking around them. It represents teamwork, courage, and the power of one mind to solve a problem others could not see. In war, people often celebrate the heroes who stand on the front lines. But sometimes the real hero sits alone in a small room, studying a crack in a piece of steel, wondering how to save the lives of strangers. His achievement reminds us that history is not shaped only by those who fight, but also by those who think, those who observe, those who understand. And in the quiet spaces where ideas are born, the future is often changed. The ocean is a strange teacher. It tests the limits of everything humans create. It pushes against ships not out of anger but because that is simply its nature. Every wave is a reminder that nothing made by human hands is ever truly safe. And for the sailors who served on Liberty ships, this lesson was felt every day. Many of these men were young. Some were barely 20, with soft faces that had not yet seen much of the world. Others were older fishermen or merchant sailors who had joined the war effort to protect their families and their country. They came from small towns, big cities, quiet farms, and busy ports. And though their backgrounds were different, they shared the same fear every time their ship left harbor. They feared the enemy submarines that waited below the waves. They feared storms that rose without warning. But above all, they feared the ship itself. Not because it was poorly built on purpose, but because it was built in a time when speed mattered more than perfection. Each voyage felt like a gamble and the stakes were their lives. Imagine standing on the deck of one of those ships. The sky is pale gray. The wind is sharp and cold. The sea looks endless in every direction, dark and rolling like a giant breathing creature. The smell of salt burns your nose. The ship creaks softly beneath your feet, as if whispering secrets from its steel bones. You wrap your coat tighter, trying to push the cold out of your chest. Every time the ship groans a little louder, sailors glance at each other with uneasy eyes. They know the sound of danger even if they pretend they don't. A single crack could begin without warning. A vibration underfoot could be the first sign of disaster. At night, when the engines hum and the lights glow dimly, the fear feels sharper because darkness hides everything. Letters from home help. A photograph tucked into a pocket helps. A joke shared between crewmates helps. But nothing removes the quiet tension that hangs in the air like a heavy fog. For some sailors, the fear became a shadow that followed them for life. They remembered the freezing spray hitting their faces, the sound of steel stretching under stress, the way the ship trembled when waves slammed into it. These memories lived in them long after the war ended. This is why the civilian's discovery mattered so deeply. He did not just fix steel. He fixed fear. He gave sailors a chance to trust the decks they walked on. He strengthened not only the ships, but the spirits of the men who sailed them. As the new designs were added, the difference became clear. The ships moved with more confidence. They no longer fought against the sea, they flowed with it. Engineers reported fewer cracks. Inspection teams returned with better news. Sailors felt the change even before they saw the reports. They sensed a shift in how the ship behaved, as if it had learned to breathe again. Convoys soon crossed the Atlantic in larger numbers. These groups of ships looked like floating cities from a distance. Dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of Liberty ships traveled together, carrying everything an army needed to survive. From above, planes protected them. Below, submarines hunted them. And around them, the ocean rose and fell in endless waves. But now the ships held firm. Supplies reached Europe at a speed that amazed commanders. Factories in America worked day and night, filling each ship with crates, barrels, vehicles, and machines. Workers packed the holds with such care that the ships seemed heavy with purpose. Every crate held something that could save a life or end one. Every journey carried weight far greater than steel. In these moments, the importance of the civilians' work became clear. The war was not won by a single battle or a single hero. It was won by thousands of small victories, and this quiet man had created one of them. His insight became a silent partner in every voyage. It traveled across the ocean hidden in the welds, in the beams, in the strength of the hull. But the story does not end with safety alone. The redesign of the Liberty ships also changed how engineers thought about ships forever. It introduced new ideas about flexibility, metal behavior, and structural design. It proved that innovation can come from anywhere, not just from those with authority but from anyone willing to look closely and think deeply. There is a quiet beauty in that idea. It reminds us that history is shaped by people who notice the small things others overlook. People who study cracks in steel not because they are told to, but because they care about the truth hidden inside them. People who understand that saving one ship might save 1,000 lives. Even today, decades after the last Liberty ships sailed their final missions, engineers still study them. They learn from their failures. They learn from their improvements. They learn from the courage of one civilian who refused to accept a dangerous flaw. His work continues to guide how modern ships are built: safer, stronger, smarter. Walk through a naval museum, and you may find one of these ships resting silently in calm waters. The deck may be dusty. The paint may be faded. But the structure remains proud, like an old warrior who survived many battles. Stand on the deck, and you might hear the faint echoes of the past, the footsteps of sailors, the roar of engines, the distant call of the sea. Touch the steel and you might feel the weight of history. You might understand how close the world came to losing more ships, more supplies, more people. You might realize that the war turned because someone paid attention to the small details. In the end, this story is not just about ships. It is about responsibility, about courage, about the power of looking deeper when others look away. It is about how one person with no weapons, no rank, and no fame changed the world through understanding. And perhaps that is the quiet message hidden inside every Liberty ship that still floats today. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a question, a careful study of a crack in steel. There is something powerful about ordinary people who rise to meet extraordinary times. During the war, most stories focused on soldiers on the front lines, brave men running through smoke and fire. But far from those battlefields, in quiet rooms and noisy shipyards, other heroes were working just as hard. They worked with pencils instead of rifles, machines instead of weapons, paper instead of maps. And their efforts were just as important. The civilian who solved the Liberty ship problem belonged to this quiet group. He never stood on a stage. He never made a speech. He never asked for recognition. His world was made of lines, angles, stress calculations, and steel behaviors. Where others saw blank metal plates, he saw invisible forces pulling and pushing, stretching and bending. Where others saw a finished ship, he saw a structure still alive, still responding to every wave and gust of wind. In many ways he lived in two worlds, one of calm observation and one of urgent responsibility. Every time another ship cracked, he felt the weight of the failure even if he had not caused it. Every time a report came in with bad news, he sat deeper in thought, sketching new ideas, searching for a solution that refused to reveal itself easily. People around him noticed his quiet focus. They described him as gentle, thoughtful, and deeply patient. He spoke softly but confidently, never pushing his ideas with force, but offering them with logic and empathy. He understood that the people resisting his ideas were not enemies, they were simply afraid of slowing down at a time when the world demanded speed. He also understood something even more important. Fear can make people blind to the truth. So he showed them. Bit by bit. Crack by crack. Diagram by diagram. He presented facts without anger. He explained steel behavior in simple language. He answered questions again and again, never losing his calm. Slowly, trust formed, not because he demanded it but because he earned it. As his recommendations were accepted, shipyards began to change their routines. Welders were trained differently. Inspectors checked new points along the hull. Designers added reinforcements that seemed small but meant everything. The transformation did not happen overnight, but it happened, and that was enough. Far across the ocean, sailors noticed the difference before anyone else. They could feel it in the way the ship moved beneath them. The hull no longer felt stiff like a frozen board. It felt alive, almost flexible, adapting to the rhythm of the sea. On stormy nights, when waves slammed against the bow, the ship groaned less sharply. On freezing mornings, when frost formed along the rails, the metal felt solid instead of fragile. Confidence began to replace fear. It didn't happen in a single moment, it happened slowly, like dawn rising over a dark horizon. One sailor told his friend, "This ship breathes better." Another said, "It rides the waves like it understands them." These words were simple, but they carried deep truth. As Liberty ships became safer, they also became symbols of something larger, the power of teamwork. Welders, designers, sailors, inspectors, and leaders all played a part. And at the center of this web of effort stood the quiet civilian who had seen the problem before others understood it. His insight strengthened not only steel but also unity. Meanwhile, the war continued with fierce intensity. The Atlantic Ocean became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Enemy submarines hunted supply ships with deadly patience. Storms rolled across the water like giant beasts. Convoys traveled under constant fear, knowing that a single mistake could cost hundreds of lives. But the redesigned Liberty ships pushed forward. They carried tanks that rolled into battle. They carried food that fed hungry troops. They carried ammunition that allowed soldiers to defend themselves. They carried hope in metal containers, crossing the cold ocean with steady determination. Every safe journey was a small victory. Every arrival at port meant relief spreading through the ranks of soldiers waiting on the other side. The war was too complex for any one thing to determine its outcome, but the Liberty ships played a role so large that many historians later called them the workhorses of victory. It is incredible to think that so much depended on a single idea, a small change in design, made by a man whose name was not widely known. But history often works this way. Great events are shaped by small choices. Big victories often grow from quiet minds. The more we look at the story, the more we understand that the real power of the Liberty ships was not their size or their speed. It was the intelligence behind their creation. It was the courage of the workers who built them. It was the faith of the sailors who trusted them. And it was the determination of the civilian who refused to stop searching for the truth. Sometimes heroism does not look like action. It looks like thought. Sometimes bravery is not in running toward danger, but in sitting alone with a difficult problem and refusing to give up. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with wisdom. This truth stays with us long after the war has faded into history. It stays in classrooms where young engineers learn to design with safety in mind. It stays in shipyards where workers understand the balance between strength and flexibility. It stays in museums where old Liberty ships rest proudly, telling their stories to anyone who listens. We often look at history as a collection of grand events, but behind each event are people, individuals with fears, hopes, ideas, and doubts. And when we look closely, we discover that one person can indeed change everything, even if they never step into the spotlight. The Liberty ships remind us of this. They remind us that progress comes from asking the right questions. That strength comes from accepting mistakes and correcting them. That lives can be saved through careful thought and compassion. And in the quiet spaces of the past, where steel once cracked and men once feared for their lives, we find the traces of a civilian who cared enough to look deeper. When we step back and look at the story of the Liberty ships, we begin to see something more than engineering or war. We see a reflection of humanity itself. Just like the ships, people also face pressure, storms, and moments when they feel they might break. And just like the ships, people sometimes need to bend, not snap. They need support in the right places. They need someone to understand their hidden weaknesses before the world sees them fall apart. The civilian who changed the Liberty ships understood this without ever speaking it aloud. He saw that even strong metal can fail if the stress is not allowed to move. He saw that even powerful structures can collapse if they cannot adapt. His work in many ways was not only about steel. It was about life. He taught the world that strength is not stiffness. Strength is flexibility. Strength is the ability to face pressure and still remain whole. When he redesigned the Liberty ships, he did more than save the vessels. He showed the power of a simple idea. Nothing survives by resisting everything. Survival comes from learning how to bend with the wave, not fight against it. This idea guided the ships across the most dangerous oceans in history. It carried them through storms so strong that waves rose higher than houses. It helped them survive freezing water that could turn steel brittle in seconds. It protected the sailors who trusted these vessels with their lives. Imagine one of those sailors standing alone on the deck at night. The sky is full of stars, cold and far away. The moonlight shines on the water, turning the waves silver. The ship cuts through the sea gently, rising and falling with the rhythm of nature. For the first time in many months, the sailor feels calm. He knows the ship is strong. He knows it has been repaired with care. He knows that someone somewhere thought deeply about his safety. In that moment, on that quiet night, a sense of peace settles over him. He realizes that even in a world torn apart by war, there are people who still care enough to protect strangers they will never meet. This thought gives him strength, gives him hope. It reminds him that even when the world is dark, kindness still exists. As more Liberty ships completed their voyages safely, trust in the design grew. Commanders praised their performance. Engineers studied the improvements with great interest. Workers in shipyards felt proud that their efforts were being recognized. And families at home slept with a little more comfort, knowing their loved ones were traveling on safer vessels. But alongside the pride, there was also a quiet sadness. Too many ships had been lost before the changes were made. Too many sailors had faced danger that could have been avoided. The lessons learned came at a cost measured in lives and heartbreak. And this is a truth that history never lets us forget. Progress often comes too late for some. Still, the story of the Liberty ships shows that even late progress can save thousands. Even delayed improvement can reshape the future. The important thing is not how quickly a solution appears, but how strongly we hold on to it once we find it. The civilian who discovered the flaw never sought praise. He did not stand for photographs or write books about his achievement. He returned to his quiet life, satisfied that his work had made a difference. But the world did not forget him. Engineers remembered his insight. Leaders remembered his courage. And the ships, those giant steel carriers, became monuments to his wisdom. In a way, he became part of the ships themselves. His voice echoed in their long journeys. His thoughts guided the movement of their hulls. His ideas traveled across the ocean in every piece of reinforced steel. Long after he passed away, his impact remained alive in the structures that survived because of him. Today, when people visit the preserved Liberty ships, they do not always know the full story behind their survival. They see the big guns, the tall masts, the rusted edges, and the heavy chains. They admire the size and the history. But if they listen closely, to the creak of metal, the quiet sound of water against the hull, they might hear a deeper story. A story about how one person's mind saved thousands of lives. A story about how the smallest details can change the greatest events. A story about how a crack in steel became a lesson in strength. This story stands as a reminder that we should never ignore small problems. A small crack today can become a disaster tomorrow. A tiny weakness can grow into a major failure. But when we pay attention, truly pay attention, we can prevent harm before it happens. This idea goes beyond ships. It belongs to relationships, communities, dreams, and nations. When we repair what is broken early, when we reinforce what seems weak, we protect not only ourselves but everyone who depends on us. The Liberty ships, once fragile and feared, turned into symbols of resilience. They became examples of how humans can fix their mistakes and rise stronger than before. That transformation holds a kind of quiet beauty. It reminds us that failure is not the end. Failure is an invitation to learn. And so the Liberty ships sailed on, carrying not just supplies but a message. That wisdom can come from unexpected places, that a single question can save 1,000 lives, that the greatest victories sometimes come from the calmest minds. The war eventually reached its end. The guns stopped. The skies cleared. The oceans became safer again. Some Liberty ships were retired. Others were scrapped. A few lived long enough to serve in peacetime missions, carrying food to hungry nations or delivering supplies after natural disasters. They continued to help people long after their military purpose was completed. Their final journeys were peaceful, guided not by fear but by memory. Every scratch on their steel told a story. Every dent carried a moment of survival. And somewhere, written between those marks, was the signature of the civilian whose design kept them alive. If we look closely at the history of these ships, we discover something profound. It was not force that saved them. Not power. Not luck. It was understanding. Understanding of metal. Understanding of stress. Understanding of human lives. And that understanding changed the world. As we move deeper into the meaning behind this story, something becomes clear. The tale of the Liberty ships is not only about steel and war. It is also about how humans face challenges, how they adapt, and how they grow. It shows that even in the darkest of times, people are capable of learning, improving, and rising above fear. The civilian who redesigned the ships did not begin with power. He began with curiosity. He asked questions when others stopped asking. He looked at cracks not with panic, but with patience. He trusted the idea that every problem carries a clue, and every failure holds the seed of a solution. This way of thinking changed the course of the war. And it also gives us a beautiful lesson about life itself. Because life, like the ocean, is full of pressure. We all face storms. We all face moments when we feel we might break. There are days when the weight of our responsibilities feels too heavy, when the world seems too loud, or when our confidence feels thin as paper. On those days, we understand what the Liberty ships once understood. Even the strongest structure can struggle under the wrong kind of stress. But the ships also teach us something else. They teach us that breaking is not always the final chapter. If we reinforce ourselves, if we learn, if we adjust, if we seek help when needed, then we too can survive the pressure. We can bend without breaking. We can remain strong by becoming flexible. And that is one of the most important lessons in the story. Imagine the civilian sitting at his desk late in the evening. The lamp glows softly. His papers are scattered around him. Outside, the world is asleep, but he is awake, studying lines drawn in pencil. He is thinking not just about steel, but about the lives that depend on this steel. Every idea he tests is a step toward keeping sailors alive. Every diagram he draws is a promise to the people he will never meet. He was not a soldier. He was not a commander. Yet he carried a burden of responsibility heavy enough to shape history. This shows us that heroism takes many forms. Some heroes carry weapons. Some carry tools. Some carry thoughts. But all of them carry courage in their hearts. As the war continued, the Liberty ships began to prove their worth. They survived storms that would have destroyed ships in the past. They delivered supplies through waters filled with danger. They returned home with scars on their hulls, each scar a story of endurance. When sailors walked onto the docks after long journeys, many of them looked back at the ship and nodded in respect. They understood that the ship had protected them just as they had protected it. There were moments during the war when supply lines were at risk of failing. If the Liberty ships had continued breaking, the consequences would have been enormous. Armies could have run out of fuel. Civilians could have gone hungry. Nations could have collapsed under pressure. But because the ships became stronger, the supply line stayed alive. The world held together through some of its darkest years. This reminds us that sometimes the greatest dangers are not loud or obvious. Sometimes they are quiet, hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. A small flaw can destroy something big, but a small improvement can save something even bigger. The Liberty ships also teach us about the importance of listening. If the civilian's voice had been ignored, the disaster would have continued. But because people listened, slowly, carefully, eventually, change became possible. Listening is often the first step toward progress, whether in engineering or in relationships or in society. Throughout history, humans have built many things: bridges, towers, airplanes, cities. And every structure reflects the people who built it. The Liberty ships reflect a generation that worked under impossible pressure. A generation that had little time, few resources, and endless responsibilities. They show us what happens when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary work. But they also remind us that mistakes are natural. No creation is perfect. No design is flawless. What matters is how we respond when things go wrong. Do we hide the failure? Or do we study it until we find the truth? The Liberty ship redesign came from honesty, the honesty to say, something is wrong. We must understand it. This honesty saved lives. And in a world that sometimes celebrates perfection more than learning, the Liberty ships stand as a gentle reminder that improvement is more powerful than pride. That growth is more important than being right. That a design can change and people can change too. The story becomes even more meaningful when we consider the sailors who served on these ships. They were brave, yes, but they were also human. They felt cold. They felt fear. They felt loneliness in the middle of the endless sea. They stood watch at midnight while the wind cut across their faces. They wrote letters by dim light, hands shaking from exhaustion. Some whispered prayers before going to sleep. Others looked at the horizon and tried to imagine home. But after the redesign, something shifted inside them. They felt protected. They felt supported. They felt like someone somewhere cared deeply about their safety. That feeling is priceless, especially in wartime. And so the Liberty ships became more than metal. They became symbols of trust, symbols of teamwork, symbols of how humanity can rise stronger after understanding its mistakes. Today, when people visit the surviving Liberty ships, they walk through narrow hallways where sailors once hurried during emergencies. They stand in cargo holds that once carried food to starving people. They climb onto decks where young men once stared at the waves and tried to hide their fear. And even though these ships are quiet now, the air around them still feels full of memory. If you close your eyes on one of these ships, you might hear the faint echo of engines. You might feel the gentle sway of an ocean that is no longer there. You might imagine the sound of boots running across the deck, of sailors laughing, of officers shouting commands. And behind all those imagined sounds, you might sense something else, the heartbeat of an idea that once saved thousands. Because ideas, when true and powerful, never really die. The Liberty ships may no longer fight storms in the Atlantic, but their lesson sails on in every modern ship, every engineering classroom, and every mind that searches for better solutions in difficult times. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of history, the civilian who made this possible would smile at the thought that his work still protects lives long after he is gone. As the war drew closer to its final years, the Liberty ships had become more than a solution to a problem. They had become icons of endurance. They represented not just the strength of steel, but the strength of human belief. The belief that problems can be solved. The belief that lives can be protected. The belief that even in times of great chaos, clarity can come from a quiet mind. The civilian who redesigned the ships never stepped into the spotlight. He remained in the background, working with the same calm focus he had from the beginning. But others who knew the truth understood what he had done. They understood how close the world had come to losing its supply line. They understood that without his insight, entire armies might have fallen, and entire nations might have broken under the weight of war. It is humbling to think about the power hidden inside a single idea. A simple adjustment in the hull structure, a small reinforcement added in the right place, carried thousands of men safely across the sea. It carried hope across oceans that were once filled with fear. It turned fragile vessels into reliable lifelines. When the war finally ended, newspapers celebrated the victory with big headlines. People cheered in the streets. Soldiers returned home. Families reunited. Cities began to rebuild. But the Liberty ships continued their journeys quietly, as if unsure what to do in a world without constant danger. Many were sold for commercial use. Some were converted into storage vessels. A few became training platforms. But even in their peaceful roles, they carried their past within them. They carried the memory of storms survived and dangers avoided. They carried the weight of the supplies that helped win a global battle. And deep inside their steel, they carried the wisdom of the design that kept them alive. In the years after the war, engineers and historians began to study the Liberty ships more closely. They examined the changes that had been made after the early failures. They looked at the cracks that once brought fear to sailors. They tested the steel to understand why it behaved the way it did. These studies shaped new industries. They changed how future ships were built, how materials were tested, and how safety was understood. Every improvement in modern shipbuilding has a small echo of the civilian's discovery. Every stronger hull, every flexible joint, every crack arrestor, every understanding of metal fatigue. All of these ideas grew from the lessons learned during those dark days of war. His work became a foundation, a base upon which others could build. This is the quiet beauty of influence. You do not always see it. You do not always hear it. But it lives on in the world long after the original moment has passed. It makes us wonder, how many other quiet thinkers shaped history without recognition? How many problems were solved by people whose names we may never know? How many disasters were avoided because someone watched, observed, and cared enough to ask the right question? The story of the Liberty ships encourages us to look closer at the world around us. It reminds us that solutions often begin with paying attention. It teaches us that curiosity is not a small thing, it is a force that can change the future. And it shows us that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. In the middle of war, there were times when people felt hopeless. When ships were lost. When storms destroyed everything. When fear felt impossible to escape. But the redesign changed something important inside the human heart. It proved that even in moments of despair, there is a path forward. It might be hidden. It might be difficult. But it exists. The sailors who lived through those journeys carried these lessons with them for the rest of their lives. Many of them spoke about their experiences decades later. Their voices would tremble as they described the fear of sailing on early Liberty ships. Their eyes would soften when they talked about the improved vessels that brought them home safely. They remembered the cold wind, the rolling waves, the endless nights at sea, and the relief they felt when the ship held strong beneath their feet. For some, the ship became more than a machine. It became a companion, a guardian, a silent friend. They would pat the steel walls as if thanking them. They would stand on deck with gratitude for the design that kept them alive. Many never knew the name of the civilian who made it possible. But they felt his presence in every safe voyage. This connection between humans and the machines they depend on is something deep and emotional. Machines may not think or feel, but they carry the intentions of the people who build them. They carry the care, the intelligence, and the responsibility of those minds. When a machine saves a life, it is really the mind behind the machine that does the saving. And so the Liberty ships remind us that technology is never separate from humanity. Every invention holds a piece of its creator. Every improvement carries a piece of the person who imagined it. And every life saved becomes part of that story. As we reflect on this, we begin to see the larger meaning of the Liberty ships. They are not just part of a war story. They are part of a human story, a story about learning, adapting, and striving for something better. They teach us that the path to safety is built with questions. They teach us that progress comes from patience. They teach us that even in the loudest moments of history, a single quiet voice can guide the world towards strength. And they teach us something even more powerful, that every life has value, whether it belongs to a sailor on the deck, a worker in the shipyard, or a civilian at a desk searching for a solution. The ocean did not care who lived or died. But humans did. And that caring changed everything. The Liberty ships, in their long journeys, carried more than cargo. They carried the truth that humans can rise to any challenge when they work together. They carried the proof that knowledge is a form of courage. And they carried the hope that even in a broken world, people can create something that protects and heals. Today, when schoolchildren learn about World War II, they often hear about battles, generals, and political decisions. But few are taught about the civilian who saved the ships. Few are told about the cracks in steel and the brilliance that fixed them. Yet this story is one of the brightest lights in a dark time. It shows us the best of what humanity can be. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Because in a world that continues to face challenges, both big and small, we need reminders that problems can be solved. That fear can be replaced with understanding. That improvement is always possible. The Liberty ships stand as that reminder. Their story is a voice from the past telling us, do not give up. Look closer. Think deeply. And believe that even the quietest mind can save the world. As the years passed after the war, the Liberty ships slowly disappeared from everyday life. Some were sold to private companies. Others were dismantled for scrap metal. A few were abandoned in quiet bays, left to rust beneath the changing sky. But even as their numbers faded, their story lived on. Historians wrote about them. Engineers studied them. Sailors remembered them. And inside each memory the same truth remained. These ships changed the world because someone cared enough to solve a hidden problem. There is something deeply human about that. We often imagine history as a series of loud moments, battles, speeches, victories, defeats. But more often, history turns on small moments, quiet decisions, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. The civilian who redesigned the Liberty ships did not fight on the ocean, but he fought a different kind of battle. A battle against assumption. A battle against silence. A battle against the dangerous belief that everything is fine, when evidence shows otherwise. This kind of courage is rare. It does not seek attention. It does not demand applause. It simply insists on truth. And truth, when respected, becomes a force stronger than steel. The story of the Liberty ships reminds us that progress is not always smooth. It is often built on mistakes. Early failures, frightening cracks, dangerous moments, these were not signs of weakness. They were signs that something important needed to change. The real failure would have been to ignore these warnings. But the civilian did not ignore them. He looked directly at the problem and found the hidden message inside it. And this is one of the most powerful lessons of the story. Problems do not come to destroy us, they come to teach us. They show us where we are blind. They point to what must be improved. They reveal the places where we must grow. When we look at a crack, whether in steel or in our own lives, we can choose fear or we can choose understanding. And understanding always leads to strength. The war eventually ended with the world forever changed. Cities were rebuilt. Families reunited. Nations tried to heal. And while people celebrated the victory, the Liberty ships continued to float in quiet dignity, as if waiting for someone to listen to their story. They were witnesses to a time when the world was close to breaking, just like they were. But they survived. And their survival carried a message for everyone who looked closely enough. In many ways, the Liberty ships are like the people who lived through that war. They faced pressure greater than anything they were designed for. They were pushed and stretched beyond their limits. Some broke, but many endured. And afterward, even those who survived carried scars, lines of stress, marks of fear, memories of nights when they trembled in the dark. But these scars did not make them weak. They made them honest. They told the truth of what it means to struggle and survive. Walk aboard one of the preserved Liberty ships today, and you will feel that truth all around you. The air is cool and still. The metal walls echo softly with each step you take. You can almost imagine sailors standing where you stand, leaning against the railings, staring at the horizon with hope and fear running through their hearts. The ship feels alive with memory, as if it has been waiting decades for someone to ask, "What did you see? What did you endure?" If the ship could speak, perhaps it would say that survival is not a straight line. It is a series of challenges, each one testing a different part of you. Perhaps it would say that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to strengthen what is weak. Perhaps it would say that compassion, kindness toward others, even strangers, can be the force that transforms fear into safety. And perhaps it would say one final thing, that no one survives alone. The Liberty ships did not survive because of one person alone, or one idea alone, or one crew alone. They survived because thousands of people came together. A civilian who noticed a problem, workers who built the ships, sailors who trusted them, leaders who listened, and nations that depended on them. It was a chain of effort, each link supporting the next. Human life is much the same. We survive because of connections. Because of the people who support us, guide us, question us, and sometimes challenge us to be better. We survive because someone cares enough to help us fix our cracks before they become impossible to repair. And this is the deeper message the Liberty ships leave behind. We are all made of stories and struggles, strength and weakness. We are all shaped by forces we cannot always see. And we all need understanding in the places where we feel most fragile. The civilian who saved the Liberty ships showed that help can come from unexpected places. Sometimes it comes from those who watch quietly. Sometimes from those who work behind the scenes. Sometimes from those who are overlooked. But when it comes, it changes everything. His work continues to remind us that human intelligence is a powerful tool. Not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that protects and uplifts. The kind that looks deeper. The kind that sees more. The kind that turns fear into knowledge. And perhaps this is why the story continues to matter, not only because it saved ships and lives, but because it shows the best of what people can be. Careful, thoughtful, brave in quiet ways, strong in gentle ways. As time moves on, the ocean stays the same, wide, deep, mysterious, and powerful. But the ships that sail on it continue to evolve, each one shaped by the lessons learned from the Liberty ships. And in that evolution, the civilian's voice still whispers through every bolt and beam: build with wisdom, design with care, protect the people who trust what you create. All great stories leave behind a message. And the message of the Liberty ships is simple, beautiful, and timeless. Strength grows from understanding, and understanding begins with a question. As we approach the final chapters of this story, the meaning behind the Liberty ships begins to shine even more clearly. They were built in a time of fear, repaired in a time of danger, and remembered in a time of peace. But their true value lives not in their metal, nor in their missions, but in what they reveal about the human spirit. The world during World War II felt heavy with uncertainty. Nations fought not only for survival but for the future of freedom, safety, and dignity. Everywhere people wondered what would happen next. Yet in the middle of this global struggle, human beings rose to the moment with remarkable creativity and unity. The Liberty ships, simple, practical, and strong, became symbols of that unity. These ships carried not just cargo but belief. Belief that resources would reach the front lines. Belief that soldiers would not be left without supplies. Belief that nations separated by oceans were still connected through determination and effort. Every voyage reminded the world that collaboration is stronger than fear, and that courage does not always look like holding a weapon. Sometimes it looks like building a ship, repairing a flaw, or trusting a stranger's idea. The civilian who redesigned these ships did not know how many lives he would save. He did not know that his insight would be studied for generations. He did not know that decades later, people would still speak of his quiet contribution. He only knew one thing: something was wrong and he had the ability to fix it. This is a powerful reminder that purpose often comes from responsibility, not recognition. He did not wait for someone else to solve the problem. He stepped forward because he cared. And sometimes that is enough. Imagine him returning home each evening during those difficult years. He would hang his coat by the door, wash the metal dust from his hands, and sit down to eat a simple meal. Perhaps he talked to his family about his day. Perhaps he stayed silent, thinking about the ships still sailing in dangerous waters. Perhaps he looked at a newspaper headline about a lost convoy and felt his heart sink. But the next morning he returned to his work with renewed effort, determined to understand the failures before more lives were lost. His work was not dramatic. It did not involve loud machines or bright lights. It was quiet, careful, precise. And yet, it had the power to shake the foundations of a global conflict. In this, we see a truth that applies far beyond the war. Sometimes the smallest rooms hold the biggest decisions. Sometimes the softest voices carry the wisest ideas. Sometimes the least celebrated people make the greatest impact. As engineers later reviewed his designs, they found not just a correction but a philosophy. A belief that machines must adapt just as people must adapt. A belief that flexibility, not just strength, is essential for survival. A belief that understanding the nature of a problem is more important than pushing forward blindly. This philosophy influenced future ship designs across the world. It shaped standards, regulations, and testing methods. It helped engineers understand how materials behave under stress, how cold affects metal, and how welded structures respond to pressure. It transformed the way shipyards were built and how workers were trained. It even shaped industries beyond shipping. Bridges, buildings, aircraft, and pipelines all benefited from the lessons learned from the Liberty ships. It is strange to think that one idea born in a time of crisis could spread so far and last so long. But ideas are like that. Once discovered, they travel freely through the minds of others, growing, changing, and influencing new generations. And in this influence, the civilian's legacy lives on. If you walk into a modern shipyard today, you will see machines far more advanced than anything from the 1940s. Giant cranes lift heavy sections into place. Welding robots move with perfect precision. Safety protocols guide every action. And yet, hidden beneath all this progress, the old lessons remain. Engineers still speak of stress points. They still analyze temperature effects. They still design structures with flexibility in mind. The old wisdom still flows through new steel. It is a reminder that progress is not a straight path. It is a chain, each link connected to the one before it. And the Liberty ships are one of those important links. For us as viewers, as listeners, as people living long after this era, the story continues to teach. It teaches us that every mistake has meaning. It teaches us that every solution begins with a question. It teaches us that we should never underestimate the power of a thoughtful mind. The sailors who survived because of the redesign grew old and lived full lives. Many of them married, raised children, and told stories by the warm light of their living rooms. They remembered the ocean with a mixture of fear and respect. They remembered the cold wind, the dark nights, and the moments when their lives depended on the strength of the ship beneath them. They remembered how the improved Liberty ships carried them safely home. Some of them discovered the civilian's story years later and felt a quiet gratitude. Others never learned his name but still thanked the ship itself. A gentle tap on the railing, a soft whisper of appreciation. These stories, small and personal, add life to the larger history. They remind us that behind every statistic in a textbook, there is a human heart beating with hope, fear, and dreams. This is why the Liberty ships matter. Not because they were perfect, not because they were beautiful, but because they were human, built by humans, improved by humans, and trusted by humans. They represent our ability to learn from mistakes, to care for one another, and to rise together when everything seems to be falling apart. And so, the Liberty ships sail on, not through the waves of the Atlantic, but through the memory of a world that once depended on them. They sail through the lessons we teach our children. They sail through the innovations that keep modern ships safe. They sail through every story of quiet heroes who make the world stronger without asking for credit. Their journey has not ended. It has simply changed course. As we draw closer to the heart of this story, we begin to see a truth that stretches far beyond ships and steel. The Liberty ships, with all their struggles and triumphs, represent the larger journey of humanity itself. A journey filled with mistakes, corrections, courage, and quiet brilliance. They show us that strength does not come from perfection, but from the ability to understand and improve. The civilian who helped save these ships did not begin with fame or authority. His strength came from curiosity and compassion. He cared enough to notice what others missed. He cared enough to study the cracks instead of ignoring them. He cared enough to keep going even when his ideas were doubted. In that caring he became something rare, an unseen guardian of thousands of lives. His work reminds us that greatness is not always loud. It does not always stand on a stage or win a medal. Sometimes, greatness sits alone at a desk, tracing a line across a piece of paper, trying to understand how the world can be made safer. And sometimes, the person who changes history does not even know that history is listening. During the war, the ocean itself became a battlefield. Waves rose like mountains, winds roared like angry beasts, and submarines lurked beneath the surface like silent hunters. The Liberty ships faced dangers from every direction. They faced storms, torpedoes, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of collapse. And yet they kept going. They kept going because human hands built them. They kept going because human minds improved them. They kept going because human hearts depended on them. And in every journey across the Atlantic, these ships carried more than supplies. They carried the hope of nations and the trust of thousands of families waiting on distant shores. To understand the emotional weight of this, imagine a young sailor standing at the railing of a Liberty ship as it moves slowly out of port. He looks back and sees his mother waving from the dock, tears in her eyes. He sees his father standing tall, trying not to show his worry. He sees his younger siblings holding a sign that says, "Come home safe." He knows the journey ahead will be dangerous. He knows the ocean can be unforgiving. But he believes the ship will protect him. He believes in the steel beneath his feet. He believes in the people who built it. He believes, without ever knowing it, that one civilian changed its design to make sure he could return. This quiet belief, shared by thousands of sailors, became one of the invisible strengths of the Liberty ships. It held them together through nights of terror and days of endless waves. It held them together when submarines surfaced in the distance. It held them together when storms slammed against their sides. It held them together when fear tried to break them. Because belief is a kind of armor. And understanding is a kind of shield. And when combined, they become a force that even war cannot easily destroy. In the years that followed, the Liberty ships became part of many stories. Some were turned into floating hospitals. Some carried food to starving nations recovering from the war. Some helped rebuild cities by transporting materials across oceans. They continued to serve long after the world returned to peace, proving that strength earned through struggle is strength that lasts. Their usefulness did not fade quickly because the wisdom that saved them was timeless. Engineers continued to share the lessons learned from their failures. They taught new students about flexibility, stress distribution, and the behavior of welded structures. They used the Liberty ships as an example of how learning from mistakes can save lives. And in every classroom where these lessons were taught, the spirit of the civilians' work lived on. It is interesting to think that the most lasting impact of the Liberty ships may not be the ships themselves, but the knowledge they helped create. Knowledge that has shaped how bridges are built, how aircraft wings are tested, how buildings are designed, and how safety standards are created. Knowledge that has prevented tragedies countless times in the decades since the war. In that sense, the Liberty ships never stopped protecting people. Their story continued to ripple outward, touching lives far from the ocean. And so, when we look at one of these preserved ships today, its paint peeling, its decks quiet, its engines resting, we should remember that it is not simply a piece of history. It is a symbol of human resilience. A reminder that even flawed creations can be saved. A testament to the idea that understanding is stronger than ignorance. The Liberty ships also teach us something deep about humility. Their problems were not discovered by the most powerful leaders or the loudest voices. They were discovered by someone who listened to the steel, who looked closely, who cared enough to question what others accepted. This kind of humility, the willingness to learn, to adapt, to improve, is one of the greatest strengths a person or a society can have. And this brings us to one final truth. Human progress depends not on perfection, but on our ability to learn from imperfection. The Liberty ships broke. But because they broke, we learned. Because we learned, we improved. Because we improved, we endured. And in the center of that cycle stood one civilian, quietly holding the key. As the oceans calmed and the war faded into memory, the Liberty ships carried their final lesson into the peaceful world. That safety, strength, and survival come not from resisting the forces around us, but from understanding them. And in understanding, we find our greatest power. As we come to the end of this long journey through history, the Liberty ships stand before us not just as machines of war, but as reminders of what people can achieve when they refuse to look away from a problem. Their steel may be quiet now, their engines silent, but the lessons they carry still speak clearly for anyone willing to listen. When we look at their story, we do not see perfection. We see struggle. We see fear. We see mistakes. But we also see improvement. We see courage. We see learning. And in the center of it all, we see one civilian whose mind held the key to protecting thousands of lives. His story reminds us that heroism is not limited to the battlefield. It can appear in a workshop, in a classroom, in a notebook filled with sketches, or in the quiet thoughts of someone who simply wants to do what is right. His voice may have been soft, but his impact was loud enough to change the course of a world war. Perhaps that is the deeper meaning of this entire documentary, that the world is shaped not only by dramatic moments, but by the gentle pressure of understanding. That solutions come from those who look carefully, think deeply, and care honestly. And that no act of goodness, however small, is ever wasted. The Liberty ships remind us that life, like the ocean, is full of forces we cannot control. Storms will come. Pressure will rise. Cracks will appear. But the answer is not to become harder and more stubborn. The answer is to become wiser. To strengthen ourselves in the right places. To allow flexibility where we once tried to resist. To grow through understanding, not fear. In this way, the story of the Liberty ships becomes a story about all of us. We are all ships traveling across our own oceans. We all face waves that threaten to break us. We all carry heavy cargo, hopes, responsibilities, dreams, fears. We all have moments when we feel fragile. And we all have moments when someone else's insight, kindness, or courage repairs the cracks we cannot fix alone. The Liberty ships show us that it is possible to survive the storms if we pay attention, if we learn, if we refuse to ignore the signs of danger, if we trust the people who want to help us, and if we remain flexible enough to bend when life pushes hard against us. When the war ended and the seas finally became calm, many of these ships sailed into peaceful roles. They carried food to nations in need. They delivered supplies to places recovering from destruction. They served as floating teachers, floating hospitals, floating warehouses, anything the world needed them to be. Even in peace they continue to help. This is the mark of true strength, to keep serving even after the struggle ends. Today, if you visit one of the surviving Liberty ships, you may see rust along its edges. You may see faded paint and old equipment. But if you step aboard and close your eyes, you can almost hear the past. Waves crashing against the hull, boots moving across the deck, voices calling out in the wind. And beneath all those sounds you might hear something quieter. Something rarely noticed. Something deeply important. You might hear the echo of a pencil scratching on paper. The whisper of a thought forming. The birth of an idea that saved thousands. And you will understand that the world is shaped not only by the powerful, but by the thoughtful. Not only by those in command, but by those who care enough to question the things others ignore. Not only by strength, but by wisdom. As the sun sets on the story of the Liberty ships, their message remains with us. A single idea can save a life. A single question can change a design. A single person can shift the future of nations. And the quietest minds often carry the loudest truth. The Liberty ships were built for war, but they survived into peace. They were born from fear, but they carried hope. They were once fragile, but they became powerful. And through them, we learned that even in the hardest times, humanity can rise higher than the storms that surround it. So let the story of the Liberty ships live on, not just as history but as inspiration. A reminder that we are capable of understanding, capable of improving, capable of protecting one another, capable of greatness even in silence. And as the last light fades over the ocean, one thought remains, soft and steady. Strength begins with understanding. And understanding begins with the courage to look closer.